Good evening, friends. My name is Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the program in Jewish Studies here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on evil spirits, wayward stars, and scribal knowledge in Jewish antiquity with our 2022 Sondra and Howard Bender visiting scholar, Professor Annette Yoshiko Reed from New York University. Now, some of you are longtime attendees at program in Jewish Studies events. Some of you are here for the first time. And for those of you who are kind of new to our community of learning, the Bender Visiting Scholar Series is really one of our signature programs. And it's an opportunity to do two things. So first, it's an opportunity to welcome into our community each year someone who is rethinking and reshaping and reimagining the field of Jewish studies. That's part of what it's an opportunity to do, but it's also an opportunity to honor the lives of Howard and Sondra Bender. We're the devoted parents of 4 children and 11 grandchildren, including CU graduate Eileen Greenberg and grandchildren CU graduates Joshua, Rachel, and Daniel. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, Howard and Sondra Bender served on many boards. They held leadership positions in many nonprofit organizations, and they were extraordinary builders of Jewish life, of education, of family and community. And we're so very grateful to the Bender Foundation for its generous support of the program in Jewish Studies and of this series, and especially to Eileen and Rich Greenberg. It's really a privilege to count you as partners in building this community, in supporting our students, and in reimagining and rethinking what it means to be a Jewish Studies program at a public university in the 21st century. Now, in a moment, I'll introduce you to our Bender Scholar, to Professor Reed, and to the conversation through which she'll be guiding us tonight. But before I do so, I want to offer just a few words on that conversation itself, on who's made tonight's program possible and on what that program will look like. So first, a word on support. As I mentioned, we're deeply grateful to Rich and Eileen and the Bender family and the Bender Foundation. And I also want to acknowledge that, like all of our public programming, tonight's gathering is also supported by the David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts. This fund honors the memory of our friend and our colleague, Professor David Schneer, who, like our Bender scholars, did so much to reshape our understanding of what Jewish studies can be. He's very much on our minds tonight. Okay, so that's a word on support. Let me now offer a word on what tonight's program will look like. I just described this program as a conversation, and that's really how we see it, as a space for conversation. And this is going to take 3 forms. So first, after Professor Reed presents, she and I will be in conversation with one another for about 10 to 15 minutes. Second, kind of after that, we want to open things up for a genuine discussion, not just between me and Professor Reed, but also between all of you and Professor Reed. And you can do that via the Q&A function on your screen. If you click on that Q&A function, you can write in a question and it will be visible to me. And I'll share it with Professor Reed and the group, and she'll respond. And you don't need to wait to the end of the program to do that. You can start adding those questions as they occur to you during the presentation. And finally, we want this to be an opportunity, not just for a conversation between me and Professor Reed, and not just an opportunity for a conversation between you and Professor Reed, but also an opportunity for conversations between you and your fellow participants. So if you click on the chat function on your screen, you can write a comment to the group as a whole. Just make sure that you're addressing it to everyone. During the program itself, the comments will be visible only to me and Professor Reed, but right now, if you click on the chat function, and again, set it to address everyone, your comment will be visible to the entire community. And so as I introduce our speaker, I really encourage you to write a greeting to the group, to say, as many of you are already doing, to say who you are, where you're from, and why you decided to participate tonight. We are a community of learning, and community is built through these types of connections. Okay, so none of you is here to listen to me. So let me now introduce our 2022 Sondra and Howard Bender Scholar. Annette Yoshiko Reed is currently a professor in the Department of Religious Studies and Scribal Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at NYU. Her research spans ancient Judaism, early Christianity, and their reception in the intertwined histories of Jews and Christians. She's written a number of books. They include Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity from 2005, Jewish Christianity and the History of Judaism from 2018, and most recently, Demons, Angels, and Writing in Ancient Judaism from 2020. That final book, the book on demons, angels, and writing, that was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award, and as of yesterday is available not only in a very expensive hardcover edition, but also in a more accessible paperback edition. I will be sharing with you during the program a link to a page with more information about that book and a special discount code that Professor Reed has shared with us. Kind of moving beyond Angels and Demons, Professor Reed is now working on a book on forgetting, and while she's currently at NYU, beginning next year, she will be joining the faculty at Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming our 2022 Bender Visiting Scholar, Professor Reed.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Sachs. Thank you also to the Jewish Studies program for hosting me. And I'd also like to have a special thanks to Eileen and Rich Greenberg, the Bender family, and the Bender Foundation for making this visit possible. This is a visit that I feel like I've already learned so much from, and it's been quite a delight to meet various members already of the community. And I must say I'm still kind of processing or thinking about the many questions we've had in these kind of smaller events, and thus especially delighted to share with you some thoughts today about this topic of evil spirits and so forth. So with that, let me share my screen and begin. If there's one thing that everybody knows about Judaism, it's that Judaism is monotheistic. It's marked by the belief in one God and only one God, a single power, a sole divinity, elevated as the exclusive focus of any proper expression of Jewish piety. Even among thinkers who otherwise dismiss Jews or disparage Judaism, this one point still resounds. Among Jews, Christians, and even various sorts of secularists, monotheism has long been celebrated as the very cornerstone of the Jewish contribution to civilization. It is to ancient Israel that the West, and perhaps even the world, is said to owe the invention of monotheism. And monotheism is thus inseparable from both Judaism and the conventional retellings of its history. What then could we ever learn about Jewish antiquity by attending to the topic of evil spirits? Our beliefs in evil spirits, by definition, not Jewish per se. And even if we do find beliefs among some Jews in some texts or sometimes, wouldn't this just be nothing else but a matter of deviance? If the history of ancient Judaism proceeds from the invention of monotheism to its spread, stretched unilinear like an arrow from Moses to Maimonides, from the Torah to the Talmud, wouldn't the rise of Jewish interest in demons in between only ever warrant a footnote or stray aside? Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this was widely thought to be the case. And thus, even among scholars, the story of Jewish demonology was not really told as a story at all. It was merely the record of some stray moments in which the monotheism of the Jews so happened to falter, weakened or corrupted, blurred or breached, diluted or polluted, or just momentarily undermined. And why should it be otherwise? After all, by this logic, the only reason to discuss a topic like evil spirits in Jewish antiquity would be to ask what went wrong. In my time here today, I would like to approach the topic from a very different direction, making a case for telling the story of Jewish demonology as a story, and even more than that, as an important part of the cultural history of Jews and Judaism in antiquity. This is a story and a history that we can see much more fully now, thanks to evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here, as elsewhere, new data from the Dead Sea Scrolls do not just fill in gaps of the history that we thought we knew. It opens up whole new purviews onto the Jewish past. And in this case, part of what we are able to see as a result is a vibrant era otherwise lost to us, in which Jewish knowledge was configured quite differently, with Jewish concerns for spirits inextricably intertwined with interest in stars and scribes alike. But first, let's return for a moment to the older conventional narrative from before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so as to get a sense of what's at stake. Representative in this regard is the entry on demonology in the 1907 Jewish Encyclopedia. Why even include an entry on demonology in a Jewish encyclopedia? For Emil Hirsch, the author of this entry, it's to answer the question of why Jews would embrace an interest like this at all. Hirsch here gives voice to two overlapping solutions that were very common in his time and following. The first was to cast demonology as primitive and popular, and is telling in this regard that his entry is cross-referenced with superstition. But second solution is predicated on a problem that this raises when applied to Judaism in particular. We do not find an interest in evil spirits in the oldest texts and traditions of the Hebrew Bible as one might expect, but rather this supposedly primitive impulse emerges later, particularly in the Jewish literature from the centuries after the Babylonian exile. For Hirsch, however, it remained axiomatic that, in his words, Jewish demonology can at no time be viewed as the outcome of any antecedent Hebrew belief. Accordingly, to explain Jewish demonology, in his view, would be to explain the conditions by which even the Jews could fall back into primitive superstition. When Jewish demonology appears and flourishes, Hirsch thus contends that it must be because of foreign influence, and he appeals in particular to the Persian belief in good and evil spirits, Persian dualism. And this is how he's able to maintain that Judaism both invented and embodies a pure monotheism, while pointing to contact with Persian culture as a contaminant, catalyzing a supposed drift backwards into dualism, and thus into demonology as well. Part of what's striking about this explanation is its particularly Jewish twist then, not just on ideas about demonology as superstition that have been common in the study of religion, at least since David Hume, but also on a common pattern in 19th and early 20th century Christian scholarship on Judaism. It tended to cast Jewish history after the Babylonian exile as uniformly an era of contamination, corruption, ethical deterioration, and theological decline. For this, demonology played a key function. Lawrence Stuckenbrook and Wendy North, for instance, have shown how Christian scholars like Wilhelm Bussert often cited the post-exilic rise of Jewish interest in demons as exemplary of the supposedly degraded state of Judaism after the exile. In Bussett's case, the very point was to set up a supposed problem with Judaism that could be purportedly solved by Jesus and Christianity. But the parallel with Hirsch and the Jewish Encyclopedia thus remains telling. Even as Bussert would be critiqued for his supersessionism, even his fiercest critics would follow his assessment of Jewish demonology, that is, as a marker of deviance, if not decline, whereby Israel's monotheism was imagined to become more and more corrupted in the centuries after the exile, when Jews lived under a succession of non-Jewish empires, beginning with Babylon during the exile, then Persia after the return, followed by the Ptolemies, Seleucids, and Romans. Early Jewish and Christian scholars disagreed about much. Both, however, thus appealed to the rise of Jewish interest in demons to tautologically prove their own assumptions about the degradation of the period that we now call Second Temple Judaism, the period between the Persian conquest in the 6th century BCE and the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in the 1st century CE. And prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there wasn't much reason to question this general habit. After all, the entire period was commonly treated as merely transitional, whether as epilogue to the Hebrew Bible, preface to Christianity, or a bridge between Mikra and Midrash. Despite spanning nearly 6 centuries, moreover, the Jewish literature of this entire period tended to be characterized as post-exilic, marked by belatedness, decline, foreign contamination, and increased distance from the divine. Many of these stereotypes still remain, but the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, has now vastly expanded our evidence for Second Temple Judaism, making it newly possible to reconsider these centuries on their own terms. On the one hand, this new evidence has been notable for unsettling the old habit of appealing to Persian dualism to explain post-exilic changes within Judaism. As John Collins and others have shown, the Dead Sea Scrolls have simply not borne out the old assumption of a connection with Persia for demonology, angelology, messianism, eschatology, or apocalypticism. On the other hand, new data from the Dead Sea Scrolls open up new possibilities of pursuing more fine-grained approaches to understanding the nature of cultural change in Second Temple Judaism, setting aside old generalizations about the post-exilic period to focus instead on specific eras therein, including some eras that have been largely forgotten otherwise in the Jewish tradition, such as the early Hellenistic age. This is the possibility that I explore in my recent book on demons, angels, and writing in ancient Judaism. There I draw especially on one set of Dead Sea Scrolls that has received a bit less attention, namely those in Aramaic. The Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls mostly date from the 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE, prior to the establishment of the Qumran sectarian community most famous from the Hebrew Dead Sea Scrolls, such as the Community Rule or War Scroll. Whereas those Hebrew scrolls speak about one community and their beliefs, the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls offer new insights into Jews and Judaism more broadly in the early Hellenistic age. That is, the period between the conquests of Alexander the Great and the Maccabean Revolt, the period especially when the land of Israel was under Ptolemaic rule as well as Seleucid rule thereafter. By Devor de Mont's count, there were portions of 121 Aramaic manuscripts discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many are too fragmentary to assess, but what remains legible are 84 scrolls from 29 different works, only 3 of which were known prior to the discovery of the scrolls. And what's striking about these 3 is that they include 2 of our very oldest known examples of Jewish demonology. Tobit, which preserves a story about exorcism, and 1 Enoch, which includes an extensive account of the origins, functions, and fate of evil spirits in its opening section, called the Book of the Watchers. Of the 2, the Book of the Watchers is far more extensive, and it's long been cited as the most ancient known example of a systematic Jewish account of demons. What we've learned from the Aramaic fragments, however, is that it circulated independently prior to its integration into 1 Enoch, and that's earlier than previously thought, dating to the 3rd century BCE, and thus prior to Daniel, the latest book in the Hebrew Bible. Perhaps even more valuable, however, is the evidence of the rest of the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, which now provide us a whole new context in which to read its exuberantly expansive and explicit concern for demonology, that is, as part of a tradition of Aramaic Jewish scribalism that flourished in the early Hellenistic age. When we read Tobit and the Book of the Watchers in the context of other Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, what we notice is their seemingly sudden interest in demons is actually part of a bigger pattern. It occurs concurrent with a seemingly sudden expansion of interest in many other topics as well that were not addressed in explicit or extensive terms within earlier biblical literature. These include astronomy, geography, cosmology, eschatology, the calendar, and the post-mortem fate of humankind. And perhaps tellingly, this somewhat radical expansion of the scope of Jewish literary concern is accompanied by something else we do not find in the Hebrew Bible. That is, self-conscious reflection on writing, reading, books, and scribes. Both are connected with a concurrent shift with respect to knowledge as well. In biblical books like Job, knowledge about the cosmos had emblematized what humankind cannot know. What is striking about the Aramaic Jewish literature of the early Hellenistic age, by contrast, is its incredible confidence in what can and can be known to humankind, or more specifically to the Jews, as the chosen people of the creator of the entire cosmos. Jewish scribes are credited with a totalizing expertise, and the Jewish past is reimagined as a line of books and writers, astronomers and exorcists, experts in every corner of the cosmos, high and low, dark and light. Exemplary in this regard is astronomy. The Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls include surprising new evidence, such as 4Q208, which speak to Jewish concerns with technical knowledge about lunar and other celestial cycles in a manner wholly unprecedented within earlier biblical literature and previously unknown to have been a component of ancient Judaism at all. A number of the Aramaic fragments also bear a connection to the astronomical book that we know from 1 Enoch, which is partially represented in Aramaic as well. There, the importance of this knowledge is articulated by means of the antediluvian scribe Enoch, who lived before the flood. There, Enoch is said to have learned about celestial cycles from none other than the angel Uriel, the very angel charged by God to lead those cycles up in heaven. And the scribe is credited too with writing down this astronomical wisdom, such as in the astronomical book itself, such that heavenly knowledge circulates upon the earth, in Jewish writings in particular. This is also the vision of knowledge expressed via the sage Enoch in the Book of the Watchers as well. The antediluvian scribe here learns even more from the angels, and he claims to understand everything, which in this case includes the firmament of heaven, the pillars of the heavens, the winds of the heavens that turn and bring the setting of the disk of the sun and all the stars, but also the foundations of the earth and the cornerstone of the earth, and the winds by which God ordered all created things. The scribal knowledge here credited to Enoch, in fact, even stretches to the angels themselves. He knows and writes the names of all the archangels, as well as their specific domains. This makes the Book of the Watchers a milestone in Jewish angelology. But what is striking when read in its own terms is how angelology is here presented as one domain of Jewish scribal knowledge about the cosmos, framed as knowledge about spirits that is akin to and sometimes blurred with knowledge about the stars. And it's in this context, too, that its innovations in Jewish demonology proceed as well. Just as Enoch's knowledge about stars include those that stray from the regular paths, so not his knowledge about angels include those who transgress. In earlier biblical literature, no effort is made to explain the origins, nature, or character of demons, and we find no sense of demonology as a domain of Jewish expertise, whether priestly, prophetic, or otherwise. In the Book of the Watchers, however, we find all this and more. The most influential part of the work is its detailed account of the fallen angels, telling about the earthly descent of 200 angelic watchers, their desire for human women, their teachings of corrupting and civilizing arts, and their paternity of these monstrous giants who torment humankind and pollute the earth. In the Book of the Watchers, this is why God sends the flood, to destroy these giants. As hybrids of angelic spirit and human flesh, however, it is only the bodies of the giants that can be destroyed. Consistent with their angelic parentage, their spirits live on, albeit now as evil spirits that torment humankind until the last judgment as demons. But the Book of the Watchers does not stop with explaining the origins of these evil spirits. It also explains their functions and their fates, and these in turn form part of a systematic explanation of spirits more generally, which outlines their proper roles and domains in the contrast to flesh of humankind. And just as its descriptions of winds blurs into its descriptions of spirits, so its descriptions of wayward spirits, like the fallen angelic watchers, blurs into its description of wayward stars, imprisoned and bound and punished at the edges of the earth. Within the Book of the Watchers, cosmology is inseparable from angelology, as it is already in the astronomical book. But within the Book of the Watchers, cosmology and angelology are also inseparable from demonology as well. What did it mean to make such claims in the early Hellenistic age? From Tobit, also in Aramaic and from the same century, we get a glimpse into some of the implications. Tobit's account of exorcism may be relatively brief, but it does serve to remind us that claims to knowledge about evil spirits were not only a matter of abstract concern in the early Hellenistic period. Such spirits were widely believed to intervene in the lives and bodies of individuals. And we learn even more in this regard from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which include both Aramaic and Hebrew magical materials, further attesting practical efforts among some ancient Jews to combat demonic forces in their everyday lives, including through exorcistic incantations or protective prayers. In one case, 11Q11, we even find a script for calling out one demon for the very sort of mixed parentage, angelic and human, that the Book of Watchers attributes to all evil spirits. What we can see then is an interface of two modes of expertise, and thus attention to these magical sources can help us to pinpoint the innovation of the Book of the Watchers not as the advent of belief in demons among Jews, but rather as the attempt to synthesize, systematize, and textualize a Jewish demonology. Magical materials and narratives about exorcism feature local claims about specific spirits, specific ailments, specific threats at specific sites, as well as their particular impact on particular human individuals. What is innovative about the Book of the Watchers, however, is the claim to know the origins, functions, and fates of all such spirits, now named and characterized as one single phenomenon, with a single history and a singular impact on humankind, rooted in the biblical past and in distinctively Jewish approaches to the cosmos and its creator. This is not just demon belief, but demonology, and it is Jewish demonology, which pointedly claims demons as a domain of Jewish expertise. After the Hellenistic age, both approaches continue to intertwine. The transmission of traditions about demons in Aramaic, in particular, is best known today from the Aramaic magical bowls of late antiquity, some of which include overlaps with 11Q11, and others of which include the names of fallen angels mentioned in the Book of the Watchers. And even into the Middle Ages and beyond, we find Jewish amulets and protective prayers that similarly feature the listing of names of archangels and their domains, akin to what we first see in the Book of the Watchers as well. But we also see, even in the Babylonian Talmud, the naturalization of the claim made by the Book of the Watchers with respect to demonology as a domain of Jewish expertise. Knowledge about demons, in fact, becomes simply naturally part of what is known by learned Jews. Modern scholars like Hirsch may treat demonology as categorically not Jewish, but this may tell us thus more about modernity than about the history of Judaism per se. What then of the other modern assumptions with which we began? Here too, we find that ancient evidence undermines modern assumptions. Taken together, for instance, our data from the Dead Sea Scrolls shed doubt on the old habit of explaining the origins of Jewish demonology as merely contamination, devolution, or decline. The interest in evil spirits that we find in works like the Book of the Watchers is hardly a slip backwards into primitivism. In fact, these and other early sources in which we see such concerns are intensively scribal and literary, learned and scholastic. The Book of the Watchers, for instance, models a new vision of Jewish scribal expertise as a cosmological wisdom that encompasses stars as well as other sorts of spirits. And as much as we might want to distinguish angels from demons, they're here treated together in a category of spirits that includes winds and souls as well. This Jewish demonology, thus, resists any easy reduction to dualism. At first sight, it might seem that at least one of Hirsch's notions holds up, namely his contention that Jewish demonology can at no time be viewed as the outcome of an antecedent Hebrew belief. As we have seen, it's certainly true that explicit discussions of demons are surprisingly lacking within the Hebrew Bible. But now that we have more sources for understanding the development of Jewish demonology, we can also see how Jewish demonology extends other elements of antecedent Hebrew belief. Foremost in this regard is a contention that the God of Israel is also the creator of the entire cosmos. Far from a failure of monotheism, then, there's a sense in which Jewish demonology, as we first see it, confirms and extends the monotheizing trends that we see in earlier biblical texts. And far from a symptom of post-exilic devolution, decline, or distance from the divine, it serves as a distinctively Jewish claim of expertise, couched in a very intimate connection with the divine, whereby Jewish knowledge about the cosmos is deemed uniquely direct, uniquely certain, due to its unique link to the Creator. What then of foreign influence? It is here, in my view, that attention to the beginnings of Jewish demonology might prove particularly valuable for understanding the cultural history of Jews and Judaism and antiquity more broadly. If it has long been common to dismiss demonology as a product of foreign influence, it is in part because of a more general habit of framing the whole history of Jewish life under non-Jewish empires in terms of a threat of foreign contamination, to which Jews thus could purportedly respond either by assimilation or by resistance. Just as older notions of Persian influence typified this assumption, however, so new evidence for Jewish demonology can push us to move towards better understandings of the dynamics of cultural change within Judaism, particularly as it relates to Jewish life under ancient imperial cultures. For this, the early Hellenistic era is a very poignant and striking test case, not least due to another set of old habits, namely the habit of reducing interactions in this period to challenges posed to Judaism writ large by Hellenism writ large. Here too, however, new evidence unsettles old abstractions. In this case, by filling in our knowledge about Jews and Judaism in the early Hellenistic period, the centuries directly following the conquest of Alexander the Great, when the land of Israel was under Ptolemaic rule. If our data from the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls offer fresh perspectives onto a forgotten era in Jewish cultural history, it's in part due to the opportunity to follow the concerns within the texts themselves. But when we do, we also happen to notice their confluence with contemporaneous materials from across the Hellenistic world, and especially non-Jewish materials from the Hellenistic Near East. We've seen how the emergence of explicitly textualized and systematic concerns for demons forms part of an astonishing expansion in the scope and self-consciousness of Jewish literary production in the early Hellenistic age. It thus proves intriguing that its articulation matches the totalizing claims of Greek paideia, especially in the forms that this style of Greek literate education was coming to define elite identity and court culture across Ptolemaic, Seleucid, and other Hellenistic empires at the time. Just as that curriculum of paideia and common education encompassed Greek grammar, literature, astronomy, and mathematics, so Jewish scribes of the same time were recasting Israel's past in the image of a pedagogical ideal that included all sorts of detailed knowledge about the structure, cycles, and workings of the cosmos. Albeit, in this case, as we have seen, spanning even further to include angels and demons as well, and the realms beyond the visible skies and the inhabited world. In the case of demonology, then, it is not so much that Jews were influenced by Greek texts or Greek ideas. It is rather that the advent of Hellenistic rule, particularly in the Near East, sparked new questions and new conversations asked by Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians, and Jews alike, and answered by each in relation to and with their own received traditions. The bookishness, anthological temper, and archival impulse of the Hellenistic age more broadly may be most famous from figures like Callimachus and the Library of Alexandria, but we can see it among Jews as well. It is perhaps not coincidental that our earliest evidence for the influence of the Aramaic Enoch literature outside of Aramaic is a Greek Jewish source from the same period, Pseudo-Eupolemus, who seems to know some form of the astronomical book. At the very least, Pseudo-Eupolemus appeals to Enoch to claim that it was the Jews and not the Babylonians who first invented astronomy, to which he adds that Egypt and the Greeks thus owe their knowledge to the Jews, who received it directly from the angels up in heaven. The Jews weren't the only ones making such competitive claims, moreover, is clear from the case of Berosus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek in the 3rd century BCE. Part of what Berosus claims is that it's actually Babylon that's the source of all the knowledge and wisdom of the world, including astronomy, and that he does so with appeal to the antediluvian past, in particular, the time before the flood, stressing its record in Babylonian books and writings. The celebration of Babylonian scribal expertise that Berosus articulates in Greek, moreover, we also see expressed in contemporaneous cuneiform sources, like the Uruk list of kings and sages. Alan Lindsay, for instance, characterizes Hellenistic Uruk as marked by a rise of antiquarianism, whereby scribes collected and systematized older received traditions to speak to new circumstances of Hellenistic, in this case Seleucid, rule. Among the results were the explicit articulation of what he calls a mythology of scribal succession. And what Lindsay observes of Hellenistic Uruk on the basis of this text could be said no less of what we have seen of Hellenistic Judea as well, when we see it through the lens of the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls. Here too we find a mythology of scribal succession, alongside a scribal renaissance of archaic lore, and here too its agents may be scribes who feel a need to reassert their importance. Although relatively isolated by comparison, Jewish scribes may have had their own reasons to defend Near Eastern scribalism to a Hellenistic present. Under Ptolemaic and Seleucid rule, after all, Aramaic literacy and priestly lineage no longer sufficed to ensure a place within the administrative apparatus. It may not be coincidental, thus, that so many Aramaic Jewish texts from the pre-Maccabean period emphasize the power of scribalism, its pedagogical importance, and reshape the entire memory of Israel's past in their own image. In this regard, the choice of Aramaic may be especially telling. Why not write in either Hebrew or in Greek? Older scholarship on Second Temple Judaism tended to dramatize the choice between Hebrew and Greek as a choice between traditionalism and assimilation. And indeed today, even the Greek translation of the Torah, the Septuagint, is often treated as if it's a concession of sorts, as if needed to protect Judaism from Hellenism. But the choice of some Jews to write in the new prestige language of Greek and to translate the Torah and other sources into Greek does look a bit different when we triangulate it with what we now know of the use of Aramaic at this very time. During the Hellenistic period, Jews were not merely negotiating some binary choice between Hebrew and Greek, let alone between Judaism and Hellenism. Some were repurposing Aramaic into a Jewish literary language, textualizing yet another cosmopolitan horizon of knowledge and expertise in which Greeks were not included, and thus casting their gaze not westward towards the nostalgia of Athens, but rather eastward towards Mesopotamia. Evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls may point to the distinctly Hellenistic context of our earliest known textualized expressions of systematic Jewish demonology. But they also challenge us to rethink the Judaism of the period, apart from older models that would limit the Near Eastern context of Judaism to the Hebrew Bible. Continued Jewish engagement with Mesopotamian, Babylonian, and other Mesopotamian scholarship, in particular, is clear from the Babylonian astronomy that we saw of 4Q 208 in the astronomical book, and it may well shape the new interest in the antediluvian past, the period before the flood, as Matthew Goff has recently suggested. In fact, in yet another later Enochic text, now known from the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, we even find an explicit reference to Gilgamesh as among the giants born of the fallen angels described in the Book of the Waters. The very choice to make a literary language, a Jewish literary language, out of Aramaic points to a creative reconfiguration of what even counts as local knowledge, far more complex than simply the preservation or defense of some static Hebrew heritage. And so too with the textualization of Babylonian astronomy and other Near Eastern knowledge in newly Jewish literary forms. These and other innovations within the Aramaic Jewish literature of the early Hellenistic age are inextricably local and globalizing. To the degree that Hellenistic rule brought new questions, new concerns, and new challenges, some Jewish scribes answered them from and with Israel's own past, forging new models of teaching textuality and knowledge out of older local, Israelite, and other Near Eastern materials. And the result was a new vision of Jewish literature and learning, integrating astronomy, demonology, and much else besides. The case of Jewish demonology thus stands as a caution against reducing cultural change within Judaism to either internal developments or foreign influence. On the one hand, the Aramaic Jewish literature of the early Hellenistic age is marked by an intensive cultivation and theorization of knowledge, drawing on the threads of earlier Israelite and Near Eastern traditions to rewrite the history of Jewish knowledge with angels and about demons. On the other hand, it resonates with the broader trends of its time. Its authors recast Israel's the ancestral heritage of wisdom as explicitly bookish, elevate scribes as its true custodians, and extend the domains of their own claimed expertise across the entirety of the cosmos, not just up to the winds and stars and angels above, but encompassing all that should be known about evil spirits as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Reed, for that kind of incredibly rich presentation. I have lots of questions. I'm already seeing some questions showing up in the Q&A function, so I want to invite participants to continue to put their questions there, and I will try to share them with Professor Reed. But maybe I will take advantage of the vast authority invested in me as the host for this Zoom webinar, maybe kick off the conversation with just one or two questions before sharing audience questions. And maybe I'll sort of begin with a question about the past and then a question about the present. And the question about the past is really a kind of question about terminology. You've used a number of different terms, referred to a number of different kinds of entities, for lack of a better word, in your presentation. In your title, you talk about spirits. In your presentation, you talked about angels. You talked about demons. Can you say a little bit more about what each of these terms means in these ancient Jewish sources, in sources from the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example? You know, what is an angel? What is a demon? And what kind of relationship exists between the two?
No, that's a great question. It's actually very hard. I spend a lot of time trying to come up with the right word to use especially within my book, because part of the issue is that the idea of naming all of these, sometimes I call them transmundane powers in the book. It's harder to say when you're giving a talk. But meaning that they are some sorts of powers. They have lots of different names, and they aren't always thought of as the same kind. So in my book, sometimes I talk about transmundane powers to try to get some general sense. If we follow let's just say Second Temple sources, so sources like the Book of the Watchers and later Jubilees, that they would describe them as spirits. So if we use their language, that's what we would describe. That's the primary categorical term that's used. The terms angels and demons are retrospective terms. The term demon, there's a Hebrew for demons, like Hebrew shadim comes to mean demons. Greek daimones doesn't initially mean demons. It means these kind of like intermediate beings. So it's just the terminology itself is kind of part of the story, which is what makes it difficult to pin down what terminology to use. Angels is actually even more trickier in some ways, because if you look at Hebrew biblical literature, that these figures are defined by their function. So it's like not coincidental, angel is messenger, but the same word can be used also for messengers, because the point is their function, not their form. And it's only kind of later that there's some sense of a consolidation, actually in Greek, around the term angelos. But I think that part of the complexity, it's not a question of finding the right term. It's a question of kind of, in my view, it's a question of seeing how the variance in the terms itself speaks to both variety, localization, and also attempts at systemization. And these are all things that we see happening in this period.
Thank you for that. I'll offer one more question, and then I'll try to share some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. And it's a question that maybe picks up on this theme you just invoked of maybe the kind of gap between or distance between the kind of concepts and terms we use today, and maybe kind of the concepts with which these ancient texts are operating, right? So you sort of just highlighted very clearly and powerfully that distance between us and the past. And you began your presentation by telling this really powerful story about how it's not just that there's a gap between us and the past, but in many ways, this particular aspect of the past has been neglected, suppressed, dealt with in a kind of complicated fashion. And I'm curious, against that backdrop, how did you come to be interested in this topic, given that gap, given the kind of fraught history of thinking about these concepts in Jewish studies? What led you to take up and in many ways kind of build an intellectual trajectory around these themes of angels and demons?
It's interesting. So for me, it's really the texts. So, I can come up with all these interesting reasons why people should find the text interesting. But there's a time at which when I first, when I was in graduate school and I wanted to learn ancient Ethiopic, as the first book text that I worked through was the Book of the Watchers. And I was just like, this is a gorgeous text. It's fascinating. I still feel excited talking about it. I mean, it's just one of these texts, and it really, it has a, it's something that it rewards rereading, but also, a number of these other texts, also like the Book of Jubilees, also in Ethiopic, but in Hebrew from a slightly later period. These are really interesting texts. They're kind of also give us a kind of when we look at the ancient Judaism through the lens of them, we notice things, in other developments as well that we may not have noticed. And they're both kind of, beautiful in literary terms. And they really I think they resonated with kind of an interest that I have in terms of just thinking also about questions of textuality and knowledge. They're texts that, they really do just like talk about some really big questions, like the entire cosmos. This is like, you could tell a kind of completely different story from, the Book of the Watchers, for instance, about the afterlife. I mean, you have a number of things where there's this like incredibly vast, capacious vision of what like Jewish knowledge can be. And it's, it's when it's within a text that's just very, even like this, like small bits of it, but especially when you see it all together, it's just, very beautiful and engaging work.
I have lots of questions about that, about the texts and about the kind of beauty and engaging nature of the text, but I'm going to resist the temptation to ask more of my own questions and maybe try to turn to some of the questions that have been shared by the audience. And I would say, broadly speaking, the questions that I'm seeing shared kind of fall into two general buckets. There's a bucket of questions about kind of context and about the kind of ancient world and ancient Jewish world in which these texts are emerging and in which these conversations are taking place. And there's a kind of bucket questions about specific texts, specific demons, specific figures. So I'll try to bring together and share a mix of these questions, and my apologies in advance to anyone whose question I don't get to given constraints of time. And maybe I'll begin with some questions about context. And the first is one about trauma. So one question that we received notes that these texts were clearly being written very near to a time of great religious trauma for the Jewish people, the Babylonian exile. What influence would you say that this trauma could have had on the new writing of demonology in the Hellenistic period? Could these texts be symptomatic of exilic trauma similar to that of the Book of Ezekiel?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I think I think with respect to the exile, the texts of the early Hellenistic age are hundreds of years after. So they're written to the degree that they engage issues of their own time. They're very different issues. The exile is, quite far within the past. And I think one of the interesting things, this is one of the interesting things about thinking about the Second Temple period with the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls is, Second Temple period is like nearly 600 years. So people often, before there was a lot of evidence, it was easy to think about it as post-exilic, as if the exile just happened. So at this time in the 3rd century BCE, the exile did not just happen. It was like, quite some time before. And also what we know of the Ptolemaic period, which is a period, it's likely written in, is actually that it was like things seem to be pretty good. It's one of these cases in which it's a period of relative stability. One of the things we know kind of economically about the land of Israel is from this, set of papyri. The Xenon papyri mention things that it seems to be a good economic situation. When people look back from it later, for instance, from the Seleucid period and the time of the Maccabean revolt, they kind of idealize this period as when things were good. So in this case, I think that this is, I don't think that the habit of thinking about the exile so close by is really supported by the text. It's not something that's really high. It's not something that is within, the text does not talk about this. And it also doesn't, it expresses a surprisingly confident view of, Jewish, the idea that Jewish knowledge survives any rupture. Because survives even the flood. It doesn't matter. Back until this kind of notion of there being a kind of direct and powerful line of connection with Jewish knowledge, even from before the flood, and the flood being this kind of, example of radical example of rupture. So there isn't a case in terms of the kind of bemoaning of that rupture. And in this case, for instance, we can compare it to works like after the destruction of the temple in 70. And there we see a different frame in terms of thinking even about knowledge. So like in a book like For Ezra, issues of demonology and knowledge are actually demons, angels, and knowledge are configured quite differently. So I think in this case, I would kind of resist the temptation to think of this as post-exilic and just this reminder of this kind of, it's a long period of time since the exile.
So the next question picks up precisely on the theme of knowledge that you just invoked. You talked quite a bit about kind of this explosion in different forms of expertise. You at one point had a quote where the word science was used, and one of the questions that was posed picks up on precisely that theme. Can we call ancient Jewish demonology and angelology a form of ancient Jewish science?
I love this question, so thanks for asking it. I think it kind of depends on how you define science, but I think it is in some ways equivalent to our category of science. So meaning that, and this is something I've written about too, where, it's one of these, because the astronomical material is such a puzzle. It was like one of the biggest surprises in terms of the Dead Sea Scrolls material. And, people like Yonatan Ben Dov have done kind of incredible work on this material and just shown how engaged it is. It's not, this is coming from a Jewish tradition about the stars that, we should call scientific, so the astronomical stuff is definitely scientific. And in the way it's presented, with angels and demons being kind of part of the same way of thinking about the cosmos, it's also scientific. It's like our concept of science in that it has to do with precise technical knowledge about the cosmos and knowledge that's perceived to be, cross-cultural. So not a kind of ancestral tradition, but, what you get from the ways of understanding the workings of the cosmos. There's a case of, there's a volume that I was part of that, Yonatan Ben Dov and Seth Sanders edited some years ago about, rethinking the category of like ancient, Jewish sciences, but in light of this material, like how do we ask these questions? And one of the things I think that's interesting too is, some of the parallels with kind of ideas of the Hellenistic age is also this kind of repackaging of, technical knowledge of various sorts into literary forms. And we see this in, in Greek and Alexandria as well. So this is at least some kind of, and we can think of it almost like popular science, like something like the, astronomical book, because it's like, it has technical materials, but it also has a kind of story around it.
Thanks. So I'm going to now try to transition a little bit from context to a few questions about specific demons or specific angels or specific figures or texts, and maybe I'll begin with a kind of bridge question here, which still talks a little bit about context, but also raises some of these other themes. Is it an overreach to see also Jewish demonology as a polemic against ancient Near Eastern and Hellenistic understandings of various gods as cultural heroes, kind of in addition to establishing a unique Jewish cosmology?
This is a good question. It kind of, there are some scholars that suggest that there's a polemical relationship, particularly, between that. Let me put it a different way. That the concept of the fallen angels is meant somehow to represent the kind of, Apkallu or other kind of, those very, Mesopotamian figures that are also seen to be culture heroes. This is, I'm not so sure. I find it's intriguing. I tend to resist the kind of one-to-one, the idea that like, oh, this within the text symbolizes this in the outside world. It's just, I don't tend to see that as being a, I don't tend to find that persuasive as a way of interpreting ancient texts, or texts in general, actually. Like there's rarely a one-to-one correspondence, but I kind of understand the case of why other people make it. In general, I would think of it, I think in terms of polemic, I would at least in this time period, so 3rd century BC, and I think it's partially we can talk about different time periods differently. In this time period, I think one of the things we can really talk about, though, is it seems to be more competition than polemic per se, where it's like, ours are older, ours know more, ours are more ancient, ours like, kind of, they were like before yours, and like ours are like, that's where all knowledge was from us, not from you. And this, you see this like, tracing back of firsts, within Greek literature, you see these like Babylonian claims, and so I think it's kind of like a realm of competition, but that's also affecting part of what it's doing is it's creating parallels in the types of questions that are being asked and answered. The whole kind of culture hero tradition like emerges in this competition, in this question of competition.
So I'll share 2 final questions, and then unfortunately we'll have to bring the evening to a close. The first of those final 2 questions has to do with some specific figures whom you mentioned. Those spirits who were formerly giants. What happened to them? What in the narrative, in the imagination? What happened to, what happens in the narrative to those spirits that were formerly giants?
So the spirits that were formerly giants are the demons, the evil spirits in the world, according to the Book of the Watchers. And this is shared, it's shared by some other literature as well. And so the idea is that they torment humankind. So one of the things with the giants is giants also are very big. So they're hungry. So demons are also hungry. And partially as a result, like humankind people sacrifice to them. So they cause people to go astray in terms of false worship. And they also generally just cause disease and, torment humankind until the end of time. So the idea is like that from this time, the flood, to, the end of the world, this is just a feature of human life, that you have these like, giants or evil spirits around. In later books, such as like, in the 2nd century BCE in Hebrew, the Book of Jubilees, you find these kind of notion of, they're kind of brought into kind of the service of, God and his angels. So they're kind of put to work, like they can only torment, they're kind of given some limits of what they can do. And only like some of them survive. But in the Book of the Watchers, it's generally just this sense that, this is why we have, various kinds of ailments. This is also why, people go astray. People know that they're supposed to do one thing and then they just don't do it. Then this is kind of, this entire realm is credited to this kind of foundational moment. These like these kind of, it's thought to be a bit tragic, it's not their fault. And in the Qumran Book of the Giants, which is also around the 2nd century BCE, also in Aramaic, it kind of gives, one of the things about that book, the book that I mentioned is naming Gilgamesh, is it gives their voices, like their perspectives. So they're just born into the world through this like terrible hybrid act. So they don't know what's going to happen. They're very distressed. They have these kind of dreams of their destruction. So there is some kind of notion, it's kind of interesting that they're given some sense of pathos, where thus when you think of them as resulting in demons, evil spirits that torment humankind through ailments, illness, that there's some way in which, first of all, they're kind of, it's kind of not their fault, you know? And they become just part of this kind of disorder introduced into the world by the fallen angels.
Thank you for that. And the last question I'll ask, maybe again picks up on a theme you just shared of sort of the pervasiveness of some of the concerns that are animating these kinds of texts. You know, you talked about resistance to acknowledging the presence of demonology in Jewish sources in the modern period. Is there any resistance to demonology in ancient Judaism? I mean, is there any kind of discomfort at any moment, or is this sort of something that is widely accepted as kind of part of the landscape of the cosmos and part of a landscape of the world?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think there are sometimes, you know, I do find kind of references to people who say like, oh, don't think too much about that. But they are also imagined to be, you know, like, you know, Ben Sira, I think, has this kind of just case of like, you know, don't worry too much about unseen things. And it's not clear if that's what he's talking about, or, you know, might be talking about something else. But I think it's hard to think of explicit polemics, honestly, in the same sense that we find them in modern times. I mean, modern times, we have a really sharp kind of, you know, Enlightenment demarcation of different knowledge and of the concept of supernatural as distinct from the natural, like one of which is taken to be real and serious, and the other one of which is taken to be, you know, fanciful, superstitious, primitive, or so forth. So we definitely don't have anything to that degree. We have sources that talk more or less about things like this. But we also have ways in which, you know, demonology is related to medicine. So it's a good question. It's very tricky. But enough of it arises, so it seems kind of like part of everyday life.
Well, there's so much more that we could ask and discuss, but unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time together. And so I just want to conclude by offering a few words of gratitude and a few words of looking sort of not just back at the past, but towards the future. Let me begin with some gratitude to the many people and communities who made this wonderful conversation tonight possible. So once again, to Eileen and Rich Greenberg and the Bender family and Bender Foundation. I see Rich and Eileen present here tonight. And, you know, I want to say academic life it was often really solitary, and your generosity, your passion, your vision is really a model for what it means to overcome that kind of solitariness and kind of open up new conversations, new connections, and new collaborations. I also want to thank, in that same vein, the David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts for making these kinds of conversations possible. Many people made tonight's program possible. There's Dan Shostad, our amazing AV wizard. There's my colleague Maggie Rosenau in the program in Jewish Studies. That beautiful music you heard at the beginning of the program comes to us courtesy of Danya and Eyal Rivlin. Eyal is our senior Hebrew instructor, our teaching associate professor of Hebrew in the program in Jewish Studies, and that was their song Shalom from the album Coming Home. And of course, last but certainly not least, to our Bender scholar, Professor Reed, for learning and thinking with us tonight. It's really just been such a privilege to learn with you these past few days, and my only regret is that we weren't able to do so in person, and I hope that we'll be able to do so again soon. So those were my words of gratitude. Let me now offer a few words of looking forward. As the spring continues, so too does our public programming in the program in Jewish Studies. As many of you know, we typically hold an annual Hebrew concert in the program of Jewish Studies, what we call our Shmuzapalooza concerts each spring. Right now, because kind of public, live, collaborative musical programs remain a bit of a challenge given COVID restrictions on campus, we're going to, for the second year in a row, release a kind of virtual concert video featuring faculty, students, and community members. For any of you interested in seeing last year's, I'm putting that in the chat, a link to that in the chat right now. That will be available in March. So please check your inboxes for that. And then we'll gather together for another public program in April. As many of you know, we have an ongoing partnership with the CU Anschutz Center for Bioethics and Humanities. We'll join them on April 26th for our annual Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program. And we're really honored to be welcoming this year Dr. Aletha Maybank, the Chief Health Equity Officer and Senior Vice President at the American Medical Association. Details will follow soon about both in-person and Zoom options for that. And of course, as the spring moves forward, we'll be in touch about next year's program, our Peak to Peak series, our Embodied Judaism Symposium, and so much more. And finally, I just want to conclude with some thanks, not just to everyone whom I've already mentioned, but to all of you who joined us tonight. You know, for many of us, the pandemic has been a time when connections are hard to come by. And against that backdrop, I'm just so grateful for what it's meant and what it continues to mean to be part of this kind of learning community that you've all created, a space where individuals from diverse backgrounds can join together to think, learn, and grow with one another. Thank you, one and all, and I look forward to seeing you at future programs.